My father was a policeman, and he came from quite a tough background. He always used to say, actually, the only way out of the place he'd come from was through crime, and you had to pick one side or the other. And he simply chose the police. And I remember when I was a kid going into a bank with him and him explaining to me how you would rob the bank. I think psychology has got in the way of the relationship between us and ourselves. It's taking increasingly kind of small and granular perspectives on the human condition. My family they have quite interesting background. I mean, a lot of the family roots are with travellers. There's a degree of outsiderness, if that is a word, in my family, I think. I suspect it's intergenerational, transgenerational.
Welcome to The Secret Resume. I'm Melody Moore, leadership consultant, coach, and endlessly curious human. For over 20 years, I've been helping leaders unlock potential in themselves, their teams, and their organisations. Before we dive in, do you want to know how entrepreneurial your leadership really is? Why not try my entrepreneurial leadership diagnostic? It takes just 10 minutes and gives you instant insights to grow your impact. You'll find the link in the show notes. My guest today is Laurence Barrett. Laurence, I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here. I've been stalking you on LinkedIn for quite some time, so I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have. So let's start off and get you to introduce yourself for anyone who doesn't know you.
Well, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here, actually. And we've just had a great conversation, which I wish we'd recorded. But anyway, I'm Laurence Barrett, obviously. I work as a coach. I work as a supervisor. I am very, oriented around applying Jungian psychology to my work and lecture on that at a few places, notably INSEAD, Henley, and Cambridge, and also Mumbai, Tata Institute of Social Sciences. So that's broadly what I do. My background is from the corporate world, HR, talent management. And before that, I worked a lot in process development and operational research at the airports at Heathrow, notably.
And your company name is?
Heresy Consulting, which has been running now for about 14 years since I left corporate life. 14 years, yeah.
So before we dive in, I'm going to ask you two questions. So why Heresy Consulting?
Well, okay, here's the thing. When Martin Luther nailed his theses to the doors of Worms Cathedral, his complaint wasn't that there was a new way to look at God, his kind of religious perspective. His complaint was that the Catholic Church had got in the way of the relationship between man and God. And he was called a heretic. And I kind of feel the same about psychology. I think psychology has got in the way of the relationship between us and ourselves. It's taking increasingly kind of small and granular perspectives on the human condition. And what we wanted to do with Heresy, myself and Fiona Hanlon, who I set the business up with, she's now retired, but she still works with us. What I wanted to do with Heresy was to return, if you like, to sort of root psychology, clinical psychology, human psychology, and reimagine what coaching, what development work, what consultancy could be like. So yeah, we're called Heresy not because we wanted to do something different, but because we wanted to do something kind of fundamental and old in a way.
I love it. And do you, like me, regret calling your company a long name because now you've got to spell things out and type a really long email address? Because that's my one regret about calling my company. Also Liberare, which no one can say. Yeah. Long. I said that to someone recently. I was like, well, my one piece of advice would be don't give your company name a long name.
A long name. No, I get that a bit, but everybody calls us Heresy, really. So although the typing is a pain, we're Heresy at the end of the day. Yeah, that's what we tend to be referred to as.
Perfect. And Jungian psychology, for those that don't know what that is?
It's really the psychology of Carl Jung, who was a Swiss psychologist, psychotherapist, psychiatrist from really about, he started working, I guess, probably about 150 years ago, something like that. My dates aren't great. And it's been one of the sort of key traditions of depth psychology. Has some particularly what I think of as systemic aspects to it, which differentiates it from something more Freudian, which is a bit more individually focused. And yeah, Jung's psychology, I discovered Jung quite early on in life, probably about, 1920. And since then, I've really been trying to find ways to introduce and to test the applications of Jungian psychology into first the commercial world and secondly into coaching and consulting. And yeah, it's an interesting psychology. It's a frame all in and of itself. Could talk about it for hours.
Well, I could talk about it for hours with you too, but maybe we'll talk about it again later because you're right. We could talk about that for the whole recording. But let's follow my usual process and go right back to the beginning and talk about some of the key people, places, and experiences that have influenced you. And let's start with your father.
Yeah, my father was a policeman, and he came from quite a tough background. He always used to say, actually, the only way out of the place he'd come from was through crime, and you had to pick one side or the other. And he simply chose the police. And I remember when I was a kid going into a bank with him and him explaining to me how you would rob the bank. Which I thought was fascinating. It's the coolest thing ever at sort of ages 6, 7, thinking, here's my dad explaining to me how to rob a bank. And he used to, I remember as a kid, he had all these true crime magazines under his bed. And I remember when my parents were out, I'd sort of creep in and read these quite horrific sort of murder things. And they really, I think, gave me this sense of being an investigator. I was very in awe of my father on that, solving things, particularly human things, which kind of made no sense. And he taught me really that if I watch closely, every system has kind of gaps and flaws. And it's simply about observing why people do what they do. And, I discovered that at the age of 6 and 7, but it's something I think that stayed with me. And as I moved through life, I've spent most of my life, and certainly I've made a living out of it, looking for gaps in the system, I guess. It was quite a profound influence on me at the time.
And how does that manifest now then in what you do in your business?
Well, I think I started my career, I guess, in operational risk, among other things, looking for gaps in process flows for like how people move through terminals, for example, at airports. And that risk mindset never leaves you because you are looking in a way for the gaps, the things which will go wrong. And when I started working in talent management, there was a developmental side to it, obviously, but there's also a heavy risk side to it. So if you're going to promote a leader, for example, one of the questions that you're going to be thinking about is not just what a great person they are, but also where's it going to go wrong and how will I know? And what are the risks I'm taking in that appointment? So a lot of my early work was very assessment heavy, looking at the overall profiling of an individual. And there's lots of I think quite inconvenient things about this. I mean, I was chatting to someone this morning about this particular challenge. I would say that the biggest risks that face leaders, for example, are not weaknesses, they're their strengths. It's overdone strengths are one of the single biggest problems facing organizations. And so if you're kind of clear about what are the spikes a leader has, if you're able to understand that, you can start to imagine on what that's going to look like in terms of an impact on the system, an impact on the leader's behavior, what are the causes for that. And so now, as I'm doing coaching work, a lot of my coaching practice is based on helping people understand themselves almost as a bundle of opportunities and risks. Where's it going to go well and where's it going to go badly? And what makes the difference between the two, which I think is particularly important for senior leaders and particularly important for senior leaders as they transition between roles. Because the big danger they face, obviously, is that they keep doing stuff in the way that they've always done it and they double down. In other words, their strengths get bigger. And as the strengths get bigger, so too do the risks.
Yes. Also, I think what got them there isn't necessarily what's going to get them. So if they're overly reliant on that, then it's the wrong things to be reliant on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in a way, the center of a lot of my development practice is on the idea of noticing. Because I believe that most people want to be good. They want good lives. They want easy lives. Generally speaking, people don't seek to be failures, seek out problems. There are obviously personality types that do that, but most people don't. And I think if people are able to better notice themselves and better notice the systems within which they operate, they are better placed to make better choices. And that's in a way that, when I think back to the things I learned when I was a kid with my father, that's very much played out in my current practice.
I love that. I could talk about this particular thing for hours, but I'm going to keep us moving on. I think this is going to be a running theme that maybe we'll need to record for a 5-hour episode. Let's talk about Hong Kong. So you were 9 when you went to Hong Kong, is that right?
Yeah, my father got a placement out in Hong Kong in a thing called the ICAC, which was the effectively a group set up to deal with corruption, particularly linked to government and police corruption, internal investigations, that sort of thing. And yeah, we went out to Hong Kong as a family. I didn't stay there that long. My parents got divorced while we were out there, but it was quite a tough challenge because it's difficult to move at that time of life. I mean, you're kind of moving from the sort of babyish education, in other words, sort of basic reading and writing and maths and picture books, to becoming, more the foundations of proper schooling. And of course, that was all profoundly interrupted, as were all my friendships. And I got sent to, it was a perfectly nice school, but I didn't really have many friends there because the friendships were all quite well established. Most of the kids there had been together since they were about 6 or 7. And it taught me in a way to be very self-reliant and independent. And I guess I came from a background which had been very cozy. We grew up in a little village in Leicestershire, and it was sort of quite nice. And I knew everyone around me, and I'd known them since, we moved at the age of 4. And suddenly you're in this sort of big city and you don't know anyone and you're very much alone. And what I learned was that I could tough it out, that I was very self-reliant and very independent and very resilient. Yeah. And it also taught me, crucially, that there was a much bigger world out there than my little village.
And does that self-reliance and independence, it's still there?
Oh yeah, very, very much so. I mean, I think it's interesting even with my practice. What I think it probably taught me was that to sort of distrust authority and to distrust systems. I mean, the two things together. And it may be, I think, slightly problematic at school in the sense that I didn't rebel against school. I just wasn't very interested. And I kind of realized moderately early on that they actually had a relatively small amount of power over you in schools. I always remember getting stuffed in some detention for behavior. And, the teacher saying to me, "You're here in detention again, Barrett." And I remember saying to him, "Yeah, but I'd have nothing better to do, sir. And you've got a home to go to," which kind of annoyed him a great deal. But it created this sort of attitude within me, which was, I'll just do what I need to do. And there is a dark side to that. One of my bosses once, called Peter Klepper, who's still around, he was PwC. He was one of the partners of PwC. He said to me, "Not everything is a fight, Laurence." And I remember him at the time. I remember at the time thinking, I have no idea what you've just said to me. Everything is a fight, Peter. But, it stuck with me years later. And I think I moderated my behavior and I became less inappropriately resistant to authority and more appropriately resistant to authority. And I think that level of resistance has also helped me in making my own path. And if you imagine in coaching, it's been one of the factors I think that's helped me define, what my practice is as my practice, rather than as a practice that I should copy or emulate.
What were you fighting against?
Oh, well, that's a complex one. I mean, in part, I think it was activated because, I was kind of out there on my own and through no choice of my own. I think as well, I mean, my family have always had a nonconformist stance, I think is the best way of putting it, to pretty much everything. So some of it is probably, intergenerational. I think a lot of my resistance to authority goes right the way back. Yeah. But I think it was simply a defense for me as an individual to sort of look after myself in the face of, large amounts of confusion, complexity, change, loneliness, which, as I said, at the time was relatively tough. I mean, I'd look back on it and it wasn't that bad, but it probably was. Right now, I think it's really helped me become much more interested in what I want to do, what I feel I need to do, rather than what I feel I ought to do.
And do you think it was that, I guess I'm curious as if that change in environment brought that out in you, or was it always there and maybe you just didn't know it because it wasn't tested?
Well, there's a chicken and egg, but I think it actually brought it out in me because I think it was already there. My family they have quite interesting background. I mean, a lot of the family roots are with travellers settled, way back in the 20s. But there's a degree of outsiderness, if that is a word, in my family, I think, which has been sort of there with all of my brothers and my cousin, and we all play a very kind of similar role within our systems. So I suspect it's always been there. I suspect it's intergenerational, transgenerational, and then Hong Kong was simply my trigger, if that makes sense. It was quite funny actually, because when my book was, I got a nice award for my book, which was terribly exciting, and I rang my brother up, who's a GP, a doctor, an academic at a well-known medical school. And his first comment to me was, people like us don't get things like that, which sort of says it all. You look at it and think, dude, you're a well-known voice in your field and you still have the chip. And I think it is. I think there's a chip on the shoulder for all of us. I think this was mine, and that was the way it played out. That was, Hong Kong activated that within me, which had an up and a downside, I would say.
And do you think that's partly why you've ended up working for yourself rather than, I mean, you worked in corporate for a long time, you said?
Yeah, probably not actually, because I'm not in a sense very, I mean, I talked about independent, but I'm not independent. I think I like to be free within relationship, if that makes sense. So I fitted really well into corporate life in that sense, provided I was given the authority and ability to do what I wanted to do. So when I started moving into specialist roles, that was a great place. And I had a fantastic boss, actually, a lady called Priscilla Vaxon, who was HR director at, 3 companies that I was at. And Priscilla was wonderful to work with because she kind of gave me a playpen and a set of things that she needed, and then just left me to do them. And that was a perfect thing for me because it allowed me to be an outsider on the inside, if that makes sense.
Yes.
I was able to deploy my kind of expertise and my specialism in the way that I felt was right, and yet still be part of something. So I do like being part of something. And even now, I tend to form client relationships which last a long while, and I enjoy working with my clients. I enjoy being part of their world, even though I'm an outsider.
And do you feel like, I'm really curious about this idea of being an outsider. Do you feel like an outsider? Or did you when you were in corporate world? Let's put it like that.
No, not really, but I do feel very marginal. And I think that's an interesting one for me intergenerationally. It's my people. I think it's also my own experience of life with moving to Hong Kong, being slightly on the outside. And I think it's also the role in a way of a coach and a consultant, because our job is, we do need to be outsiders on the inside, insiders on the outside.
Yes.
You have to have an independent perspective. And yet at the same time, we need to be in our clients' minds and in our clients' worlds if we're going to understand them. We are, by our very nature, moving between worlds in liminal spaces, helping our clients move from A to B. And in that space between the two is where the coach and consultant adds real value, because we help people through the uncertainty, complexity, alienation, isolation that goes with those transitional states. And I think if we understand it, because that's kind of, A, we've experienced it, but B, it's also quite possibly our nature, our character, then I think we're well placed to do it. I mean, if you want someone to take you through the valley of death, you need someone who's been there before you, so to speak.
I often say that you need to be similar enough that they'll let you in the door, but different enough that you can actually be a catalyst for change. And I think that even comes down to what you look like and how you dress. Like, I've always felt really strongly that otherwise you're in danger of just assimilating, and you can't be that catalyst.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And it's interesting for Heresy, actually, because I would say our clients are typically highly conventional businesses with a great deal of confidence in their skill set. We don't work for creative industries, for example. So we're working with people who are very comfortable in their own skin and yet at the same time need something else. So yeah, we fit and yet at the same time we don't.
Yes, you fit enough. And I've seen both people and organisations be really tissue rejected because they were too different.
Yeah, exactly. Or if they're too similar, then what's the point of them, right?
Yes, exactly. Interesting. Right, let's talk about, I love this one. This is when you became a Marxist. Angela Davis, let's talk about her.
Yeah. And Angela Davis is an incredible woman. She's still alive. She's one of the people I would very much like to meet. If one day I ever get to meet one of my heroes, then she would be the one I want to meet. She was a Black Panther back in the 60s. She was actually on America's Most Wanted list for a little while. And I saw an interview with her when I was a kid. I mean, I was 13, 14 or something like that. And what interested me was she had this very definite perspective that the inequality that she was facing as a Black woman in the States wasn't necessarily just due to color. Her view was that it was about class. And the class battle was an issue that affected most people because we were trapped into a system which effectively siphoned money upwards for the benefit of a few off the backs of the majority. And it was a very clear view. She's a very articulate woman, actually. She now works in the US prison system, and she's really, really impressive. And that kind of idea about universal class struggle as a thing that united people, for me, was really inspiring. It made me, it didn't make me aware of injustice, because I think I was aware of injustice beforehand, but it gave me a frame. And I got very interested in Marx and Marxist thought as a result, and the way in which, if you like, the ruling class sort of maintain their position. And it made me very interested, I think, in the value of education, because I think probably before that age, I wasn't that interested in education. And for all the kind of lack of, the disrespectful authority that I mentioned, I didn't really engage very much with the educational system. But I think when I kind of found her, and I spent, literally weeks and months sitting in the library. I'd read Das Kapital when I was about 13, not in German.
Disappointed in you.
Yeah, I know. Sorry about that. Out there, but I spent a lot of time in the library in Wellingborough, which is where we lived, reading political literature in the broadest sense, actually, inspired really by her, and that prompted me to really start to take education seriously. Obviously, I still didn't take schooling seriously, which created all sorts of problems for me, but education became really important for me, how I educated myself. And I think the other thing she said, which I really stayed with me, she described herself as a reluctant warrior. And that sort of really resonated with me, because it gave me the sense that, there was a struggle to be had, but the struggle had to have purpose and had to have a point. And I think it set me off on a lifelong journey of wondering about what I was there to do. What was my opinion? What was my voice? What did I need? What difference did I need to make? And I don't know, it's taken me a long while to really come to terms with that. But yeah, I think she set me off on a path. One day I would like to meet her. I hope I do one day.
And so that reluctant warrior then, that immediately to my mind gives a sense of, is that your purpose? Do you have a sense of purpose of what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I think I have a sense of purpose. I don't think I have a purpose. I think it comes back a little bit to this sense of voice, being able to notice things and being able to talk about them. I think that's sort of how I try to work as a coach. It's how I work as a consultant. Notice the organizations, notice the individuals you work with, and talk honestly and openly about what is going on. And I think that is in itself a struggle. But I think there's a lot that's redemptive in there. It's redemptive for individuals. It's redemptive for organizations. And crucially, it's redemptive for me, because it allows me the sense that I'm, my younger self, so to speak, is able to talk about the things that I probably wasn't able to talk about, or didn't have the voice, or didn't have the ability to articulate some of the things that sort of bothered me. And the reason the warrior piece is important there is I think it's difficult, because if you speak out about particular problems, it creates difficulties. You're going to upset people. If you talk in an organization about organizational risk and you're really touching the real issues, yeah, you're going to be unpopular. If you talk to an individual about how their method of working, their tried and tested methods are just not going to work for them going forwards, and what do they want to do about that, you're not going to be popular because it's profoundly inconvenient. So it requires a degree of courage, if you like, to have that.
Yeah, there's a book called Coaching with Backbone and Heart. And I just really like the title.
Yeah, it's a great title. I've not read it, but it's a great title. Yeah.
I think that was probably when I realised how brave you have to be being a coach. And particularly if you're someone who wants people to like you, or, there's always that complex relationship that you're always trying to navigate between, support and challenge, for want of a better way of describing it, isn't it? Because you don't want to turn off the person you're working with by being too scary for them.
Yeah, and it comes back to that line again, because you are working with someone who needs to move forward, who's probably aware of why they need to develop, but they need you to help them through that, because if they knew what they wanted to do, they'd do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not rocket science what we do. So at one level they do know, but at another level, that's a big jump.
Yes.
And it's frightening for them, and the fear and our ability in a way to carry that, to face that fear, to face the discomfort that comes with that, and to not be afraid of it, in a way allows them to detoxify their own emotional state, and allows them to think, well, if you're not afraid of it, then I probably am not afraid of it. So let's work.
Yes. Yes. I find a lot of people come to me because they intellectually understand that they have a challenge with something. And for me, a lot of people come to me because they intellectually know that there's something in their past that they're still carrying with them. Intellectually knowing it doesn't mean they know what to do with it, or how to deal with it, or how to be different. They just, and for me, that's been really interesting in how my practice has evolved. Is I'm much more interested in what their body's telling them now than what their head is telling them, because the head will only get you so far.
Yeah, I think you're right with that. And I'm very interested. I mean, I'm increasingly interested in the somatic stuff, but I think crucially, the attitude of the coach is the defining factor here, because if you have a coach who is not afraid of fear, so to speak, then there's a huge bonus in that, because you think, well, if my coach isn't being overwhelmed by my concerns and my issues, then I can face it. Whereas if you have a coach who rigidly sticks to a process, or is afraid of the unconscious, or who's afraid of difficult emotions, then what effectively you're receiving as a client is, well, my coach is scared of that, so I should be scared of that as well.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of problematic. And so for me, the reluctant warrior idea was kind of summed it up beautifully, because coaching it's a difficult profession. I mean, a lot of the times it's a pain in the neck. Sometimes it's not fun at all, but it's worth doing.
Yes.
And it's worth doing for me, and it's worth doing for my clients. And, there are discussions that need to be had, and, I'm here. So.
I think I get as much out of it as my clients do, if I'm honest. There's just something for me about the connection, and that sense of really, when you walk out of a session, you think, I actually really genuinely helped that person. There's nothing like it to me. I think it's the luckiest job in the world.
Well, when it works, it is.
Yeah, it's not when they're like this.
We all like talking about our success stories, but we're just about to kick off a piece of research actually at Heresy, where we're looking at the coach's motivation, why they coach, and the extent to which that shapes their practice. Because what I notice a lot in supervision is that many of my clients, their kind of primal motivations from early life or intergenerational, define quite literally how they practice, who they work with. And bringing that to consciousness really enriches the practice, actually. It allows
100%
them to use themselves much more effectively as a person.
Well, we clearly completely aligned in the way that we're thinking, because that's on my list of things to write about, is to think about developmental trauma and how, as coaches, it shows up in our coaching. So we're completely aligned with what we find interesting, because I think it's interesting from both perspectives, isn't it? It's interesting to understand as a client how you show up as a client because of your developmental trauma is my particular interest, because I see the way that different clients behave towards me because of the different things that they are challenged with and how they behave towards coaching. But then on the other side, how do I as a coach show up to my clients based on my developmental trauma? So yeah, I find the whole thing deeply interesting.
There's a kind of archetypal idea in Jungian psychology which I'm very drawn to, which is the wounded healer. Which basically suggests that you are best placed to work with clients who share the wounds that you have.
Yes.
And that's for two reasons. One, you see them more clearly because you know where you're coming from. And there's a risk in that, which is you project yourself onto them and their problem becomes your problem, etc. But you do have an innate understanding of some of the issues. But the more important question with the wounded healer is the client is able to look at you and think, well, you've got the same problems I've got and you're able to deal with them and you're not that much better than me. And therefore you can teach me something.
Yes.
Whereas if you don't have those wounds, if you're working with a coach who is perfect on a particular topic that you're very broad on, actually, it's quite intimidating, I think.
Yes.
It's much easier to work with someone who's a bit like you and is, sort of has the same problems you've got. So the wounded healer archetype is a kind of powerful idea, to be honest.
I have increasingly shared with people when I see something that they have. I've kind of moved away from this coach as a kind of blank slate to being much more human. And if I have experienced things that my clients have experienced, I will now tell them, whereas a few years ago, I would never have done that. But I think you're absolutely right. It makes them feel better because you're not sat there being this perfect, invulnerable person. Yeah. You're normal like them.
I mean, this will be a bit controversial because some people wouldn't like this at all. But I think the idea of coaching and objectivity is a complete myth because we know we're always in relationship when we're in relationship. So if you look at something like neural entrainment, the idea that thought may not be individual and we're constantly exchanging what we would term projections, but, it becomes a physical factor in the brain. So we know we're in relationship. And I would say that, the idea of objectivity taught by many coaches is a defense, actually, against relationship, which has an impact on the client. And for some clients, that is simply a coach that is a bit objective and a bit distant. And for some clients, is a repetition of perhaps early childhood trauma.
Definitely. I've, as I said, very interested in the somatic side of things and also the energy exchange between the coach and the client, and that sense that I can feel what they're feeling in the moment, which is incredibly powerful. And sometimes I can feel things that they don't know that they are experiencing. It's a weird thing, but when I say, oh, I felt X, they're like, no, that is what I'm feeling. I just was trying not to, it's often sadness or anger or whatever.
This is the nature of relationship, right?
Totally. Yeah. Totally. Right, let's talk about somewhere I love, the Dordogne. Cave paintings, and you are the first person to come on the podcast to talk about cave paintings in the Dordogne. So tell me why you chose this.
Okay, well, I mean, it was an interesting one for me. I was at university, I did a lot of rock climbing, and me and a friend wanted to spend the summer rock climbing without having to do any work. And the Dordogne is warm and pleasant, and we were keen to go there. And we discovered that the university gave grants for suitable academic studies in the holidays. So we thought, well, there are cave paintings in the Dordogne, let's go and study cave paintings. And the university gave us money, and off we went, which was very nice of them. And what's interesting about cave paintings was and if you've seen them, you'll know this. But for those who haven't, you kind of imagine they're just going to be kind of primitive pictures of bison on rocks, and that's kind of it. But it isn't that at all. What you're looking at are images that are painted kind of into the wall. So the wall becomes part of the painting, and under sort of particular candlelight conditions, for example, they almost become alive. I mean, they're extraordinary images, really quite advanced, really quite powerful to look at. And I was kind of blown away by these things. And yeah, we still did the rock climbing, all the usual stuff, but we spent a lot of time in the caves. And I was lucky enough to meet a French authority on cave art who said to me, understanding cave paintings is like understanding the catechism of the Catholic Church based on a floor plan of the Vatican, which wasn't kind of very helpful. And it sort of frustrated me in a way, because I thought there's something I'm almost touching on here that I don't understand, but I feel I do. And it was very difficult, very complicated experience. And a few months afterwards, my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, gave me a book called The Myth of the Goddess by two Jungians, Jules Cashford and Anne Baring, which is an excellent book. It's a really, really good book. I'd recommend anyone reads it. And it's a breakdown of goddess imagery through the ages, through a Jungian lens. And once I read this, I suddenly started to understand that the cave art could be seen in the same way, that some of it could be seen as what in Jungian terms we would call archetypal. So touching on the raw psychosomatic experience of human beings in their world. And you don't understand the cave art in the Jungian frame in a sort of purist final way, but it allows you to move towards a framework through which you can start to imagine what the cave art might mean and what it might mean to you. So it sort of opened up the idea for me that the mysterious, the supernatural, which by the way was something profoundly deep in my family background, lots of fortune telling and other such things. It allowed me to sort of work with that in a way that felt more kind of scientific, if that makes sense, more conscious.
What did you do? So you were 20 at the time that you did this. What did you do with this emerging interest and experience?
Well, I sort of sat on it for a while. I didn't really do anything with it, but it was always there. And once I started working in particularly culture change originally, and then moving into leadership development, particularly culture change, it added to my sense of systems this ability to notice that people did things for strange and mysterious reasons. And it allowed me to start wondering about archetypal ideas. So, what is the role of the organization as an archetypal father or mother? And it helped me get a kind of richer understanding, if you like, of the unspoken mystery of organizational life. And I think as I got more connected with talent management and leadership development, then I started to apply my thinking into quite literally leadership programs, organizational change programs, which led to kind of where Heresy is today. I didn't tell many people about that, by the way.
I was just about to say that because, we talked about that kind of being similar enough to be let in and not too different. So was it a sort of secret underpinning of your foundation of your thinking?
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, my master's thesis was on liminality, rites of passage. It was a critique of rites of passage from a Jungian point of view and an application of that into organizational leadership development programs. So what I was kind of playing with was this idea of, wouldn't it be interesting to develop a leadership development program, which was a rite of passage in kind of classical psychological, anthropological terms. And so a lot of the work that I was doing towards the end of my corporate life was taking some of this theory and these ideas and going, well, what would it look like if it was in a corporate development, a leadership development program? Without being too overt about it, in fact, being moderately secretive about it, I was able to deploy certain principles. And most of the work Heresy now does just takes that a little bit further and in a way quite literally applies Jungian theory into things like development programs and consulting. It doesn't always work, but where it does, it's very powerful.
So are you more overt about it now?
Oh yeah, I would say so. And I think people kind of buy that too, because there's a depth to it, and you do need to know what you're doing. But combine that with the sort of reality of organizational life, and yeah, people buy that. It's the
And you
word.
said it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. What are your experiences where it really works, and what about the circumstances where it's less successful?
Well, here's a problem with psychology, which is profoundly inconvenient for psychologists, which is the hard problem of consciousness. We still don't really know how the mind works. It's all based on phenomenon, and it's all based on our understanding of those phenomenon. And part of the understanding of the phenomenon is based on ourselves. So, we can't, in a way, understand the human mind properly because we're always seeing it through the perspective of our own mind, which brings all sorts of potential bias in there. So we have an imperfect understanding, if that makes sense. So when you look at something like Jungian theory, it's pretty good, actually. I mean, I like Jung's work. I think it's great. I think there are bits that are missing. I think there are things which are of the time and of his time and of him. The world moves. And as we look at, let's say, neuroscience, some of it's making very clear that his observations were solid and grounded, and some things saying, well, possibly not. So if we look at leadership development programs, for example, a lot of the commentary on liminality from depth psychology is based very much in the dyadic relationship that exists between coach and client. So liminality is something that can be experienced between two people, one of whom is a coach or a psychotherapist. Technically, that's not actually correct theoretically, because one of the things that liminality requires is the experience of relationship in group, what they call a communitas. And Jungian theory doesn't really reflect that. So I spent quite a lot of time looking at group analytic theory, so the work of Fuchs, S.H. Fuchs, which does allow you to understand it in those terms. So I think for me, one of the important things in this journey was to be inspired by Jung, to take a kind of Jungian approach to my work, but recognizing as well that there's a whole bunch of other stuff that needs to be thought through, including more advanced modern organizational life, advances in neuroscience, different perspectives on, gender, all of those sorts of things all need to be constantly changed and recombined.
Yeah, it's interesting when you were just talking about, that relationship between the coach and the coachee, client, whatever we call them. But of course, there's a bigger client there as well, isn't there? There's the organization as the client and the complexity that brings to the coaching relationship, sometimes subtly and sometimes heavily, makes for coaching even more interesting, I think.
Yeah, it does. And that's, again, it's been very useful as I've developed my thinking. I mean, my master's was in child and adolescent psychotherapy, and the being introduced to ideas like holding and the holding particularly of infants and the way developmental spaces are created by parents has been incredibly useful in understanding not just holding of the client, but also creating a boundary which keeps the organization out.
Mm-hmm.
So that you're able to allow for development to happen without this constant level of persecution that sort of exists from time to time. So, yeah, I think, so for me, working in-depth psychology in that way is not reading Jung doesn't, I don't cut and paste the ideas because I think they have a use. But I think I look at it as an inspiration. And the more I'm able to draw on different forms of psychology and neurobiology, and then myself take those and go, well, how does that apply into my world? I think that's the essence of my practice now.
Okay. So let's build on this, I think, because your final thing you're going to talk about is your checks notes, Executive Masters in Change at INSEAD. Tell me about that. It sounds fascinating.
Well, it's an amazing program. I first came across this when I asked one of the professors there, Roger Lehman, to come and speak at an event I was running and corporate life, and he kind of participated a bit in the event. And he said to me afterwards, this is depth psychology that you're doing here, and yeah, you got me there, Roger. It actually is. And he asked me to come along and initially do some visiting lectures at INSEAD on the MC, and then later become what they term a practicum supervisor, helping people work through kind of organizational ideas, applying psychosocial systems, depth psychology, basically into their learning. And It was a really great experience for me because the faculty at EMC is a really good one. People like Roger, Eric van der Loo, Antonio Polzer, Gilles Amadou, and others who I haven't got time to name, but really impressive people, all of whom are profoundly, I mean, far more than me. It was very challenging, actually. When I first started, I was 44, and, you know, some of the guys I was working with were well into their 60s, some into 70s and 80s, and they really knew things, and I'd read their papers and their books, and I really didn't in comparison. So it was a hell of a challenge. One of them actually used to call me the boy, rather. Which was, you know, it was really tough, actually. It was quite challenging because I was there among a group of people who in a way were role models for me in terms of their thinking and their capacity to take these kind of quite esoteric ideas and bring them into organizational life. And that was an inspiring time. I've been working in INSEAD now for 14 years on this program. And I think what it's done for me is to help me become much more confident in my own opinion beyond the things I'd learned. I remember a particular conversation with Gilles Amadou, who's a very gifted French psychotherapist and psychologist, and now retired. But he actually asked me a serious question, you know, how do I compare and contrast Jungian psychology with Marxist-Leninist dialectics? And it was a very complicated question, and really interesting for me at the time because he actually wanted to know what I thought, not what the theory said, but what I thought. Genuinely interested in what I thought. And it was a real moment for me of, wow, you know, I've got an opinion here that somebody might want to listen to. And not only somebody actually who inspires me. And I think that really helped me get a sense of what I wanted to do next, which was not simply learn the theory and be good at it, but actually take it forwards in a way that people like Roger, particularly Roger Lehman and Eric van der Loo had done with the EMC, take it forwards and start to think of new ways to apply Jungian theory, depth psychology as well, more broadly, into organizational life. It gave me the confidence, basically. I'm in debt to them.
What I just heard you describe from Gilles, was that his name,
Yeah.
did you say?
Gilles Amadou, yeah.
That's real intellectual humility, isn't it? That he's this guy who's been there for a long time doing all these things, and he's asking you as the new guy about your perspective on something. And I love to hear that he wasn't just telling you or asking you as a challenge. He was genuinely curious, it sounds like.
Yeah. And I think this was a really interesting question because all of the faculty there, they really do know things. And that has given them, I think, a degree of humility because none of them have got anything to prove, certainly not to prove to me. And as a result, it helped me move my learning from simply trying to copy or impress, which is, I think, something we all get tied up in at a point in our career, to actually just having genuinely stretching conversations about what I did think and what I did believe and what I was prepared to support and endorse. And it really helped me move forward. Actually, a journey which my current supervisor, Tess Castleman, has really helped me with as well. You know, that ability to think about things that you know that are concrete and you can support, theory, and then say to them, well, what would it look like in an organization, leadership development program for a global organization? What would that look like if it was applied there? And that does require a bit of bravery, to be honest. It exposes you. So it's important. And I have a bit of a debt to those guys for that reason.
Well, it requires bravery from you, but it also requires bravery from an organization that you're working with because, you know, often I think some of the more exciting, radical ideas are, you know, the person who's buying you and bringing you into the organization also has to be brave.
Yeah, but it's an interesting one, that, because and I do encounter that as a view sometimes. I don't think anything I do is radical or even that exciting, to be absolutely honest. And many of the people who join Heresy get profoundly disappointed quite quickly because, you know, we're helping leaders build confidence to lead. That's kind of it, really. You know, we help them figure out what sort of a leader they want to be. We work with insurance companies. We work with banks. I mean, this is not kind of exciting stuff on one level. It's ordinary, and I get very excited by the ordinariness of it. This is life, And I think for me, the exciting thing about Jungian work here is I'm not, sitting in a sweat lodge, sort of imagining the goddess. I'm deploying some of these very kind of old, very well considered pieces of theory into the real world. So it's quite ordinary in some ways.
Mm.
Well, one of my clients, I used to work with her way back when I was in insurance, and I used to run resourcing and organizational leadership development for a large insurance company. And I remember her turning around to me and she said, "Laurence, just face it, you're a training manager for an insurance company." And it sort of put me very definitely onto the ground. But one of my reflections on that is, yeah, that's kind of all I am, really. We're not doing anything magical in business. It's just business. But there are really important things in it in terms of how people develop and the contribution they make. We need to know the depths, but they don't need to know the depth. They just need to know we know the depth. That's all.
Yes, I agree. And I think too often we think we have to show them the depth that we know and we don't.
Exactly. And that's what I learned, I think, from Anton and Gilles, because, and Roger and others there, because they really did know what they were talking about. I know that because I've read their papers. But they talked in very ordinary terms.
Mm.
And that was what the work we do,
I would also disagree with you and say it's not magic, because I think it can be magic. And I think sometimes when you can be very effective as a facilitator, as a coach, it can feel like magic to the people that you're working with, because they almost like they don't know the workings, I suppose. That's what magic is, isn't it? It's something happens and you don't know why or how.
Yeah, actually, I do agree with you. It's weird because I had I have a foot massage every month, which is very nice. And the woman who does it is she's a reflexologist and very skilled at her work. And today she was like, "Oh, it's interesting because you've got this tension in your foot here, and so you've got a problem with your neck, haven't you?" And weirdly, yes, I've got a stiff neck from a workout I did, and it's been really painful for 2 days. So in one way, I listened to that and I'm like, that's amazing. In another way, you think, well, she's trained to do it. So if she hadn't noticed it, probably she wouldn't be very good, would she?
But I think often people undervalue what it is that they do. I was talking with a client the other day and I was saying, you've got this real strength in this particular area. And she's like, yes, but that's just normal. I'm like, it's not normal. Just because you find it easy doesn't mean everybody else does. We've all got our magic. We just don't always recognize it.
You're right. And we all need a reminder of that, actually, from time to time.
Right. Let's look forward, well, a little bit of forward and a little bit of back, but let's look forward in terms of what's next. What next for you? What's next for Heresy?
I mean, what's next for Heresy is, to continue to do what we do. I have a real feeling myself about developing the profession, about developing leaders. I think if we are able to work with clients to build more effective leaders, then that will benefit everybody. It will benefit society, given some of the larger organizations that I work with. So Heresy, really, it's just to continue to contribute. And I think for me, I'm doing less coaching work now. A lot more of my practice is based on supervision. And I think my shift is much more now towards helping coaches develop their practice and helping leaders to an extent develop their practice, but particularly coaches. And so I guess, what I'll do is I'll do more developmental work. I'm enjoying the work I do with a few business schools, and I'll probably write more.
About what?
Terribly boring. Jungian psychology and how it's applied into organizational leadership development. That's sort of where I come from. That is my life's work. It's my passion, actually. I'm very interested in that. So yeah, that's what I'll probably focus on.
And looking at things from your perspective of a supervisor, then I'm really interested in your view on, what coaches struggle with.
I think there comes a point for many coaches, and it's certainly my clients tend to be people who are good coaches. So they know what they're doing. They know how to coach. And they come to a point where there is almost this question of, is this it? Am I just going to do this for the next 20 years? And there's a sense that something's missing. And I think that's if you like, the second stage of coaching. The first stage of coaching is literally learn to coach. There's some things that you should not do because they are bad. And there are some things that give you a good foundation. So learn that stuff. I think the second phase, though, is where people are more into how do I align my practice with my sense of self, with how I'm developing myself, with where my life is leading me. And I think that's something that starts as a kind of doubt, a sort of itch that needs to be scratched, a sense that, I'm bored. One of my clients actually famously said, I love this quote, he just said, I'm boring myself now. And I remember thinking, this is great because boredom is a lack of connection. That's all boredom is. I'm just disconnected from what I'm doing. And he's very disconnected. So how do we reconnect? And the way we reconnect, I think, back to this wounded healer idea, is we bring ourselves more into our practice. And our practice becomes a reflection of us in the world in which we're in. And the clients we then appeal to will be the clients who need what we as people have to offer, rather than simply as a kind of generic cookie cutter type of coaching. And I think that's important. It's how I'm developing. And it's certainly as a supervisor, what a lot of my clients seem to be looking for.
And I think it's when you do that, it actually makes it easier for clients to know what they're choosing. Because I think one of the dangers with, in a lot of organizations, they might get to chat to a couple of people, is how do you differentiate between those people? Because often, and then it's just based on whether you like them or not, rather than what is it that they bring.
I think that's true. But I think it's interesting, that the like bit is interesting because you could look at it as a kind of, do I like this person? Are they smiley or whatever? But there's also a kind of, we've forgotten in a way rapport. It's interesting because rapport is a word that for me has been rediscovered in neurobiology and things like neural entrainment, the work of Yuri Hasson, which is very good. If people haven't read it, they should do. It's really cool stuff. Because rapport is that sense of connection. And it's an intuitive, projective sense of relationship that is often born out of this kind of, I have a need and you have a need, but you're a bit better at dealing with it than me. So can we talk about that? This wounded healer idea. And I think that when coaches and indeed psychotherapists, because some of my supervision clients are psychotherapists in this, I work with them not on client supervision, but on practice supervision. A lot of that is a reconnection with who do I want to be? What are the conversations I need to be having with my clients where I can add value and they have a need that they can receive value from me? And I think the more connected we are with that, and we all know this, right? Even from the early days, there are clients that just really interesting, really satisfying to work with. You may not even like them, by the way, but they're really satisfying to work with. Those are the moments of practice where if we can align ourselves, not only are we happier, but we're doing better work.
Mm. You mentioned some of your supervisory clients are psychotherapists.
Yeah.
What's the difference between coaching and therapy? Is there any difference?
There's a chat. Well, I think there is a difference, but it's a complicated one. You hear all sorts of very kind of simplistic differentials between the two, and they don't tend to stand up very well. Coaching is about looking forwards and therapy is about looking back, which is one of the things I've heard. Well, that would mean that Jungian psychology isn't coaching then, because isn't therapy, because it takes a progressive stance. If you look at, let's say, CBT and CBC, they're very similar in very many ways and light years apart from Jungian analysis or Freudian analysis. And then you look at coaching, you take something like NLP and compare it to, let's say, psychodynamic coaching that you might be taught at the Tavistock. Again, very, very different ways of working, all valid. And I think the difficulty is that we are working in a relational frame. That's what we both have in common, which, by the way, we also have in common with parenting and friendship. So we're in a relational frame and we are applying a kind of intentional level of theory and practice to our work. So there is a reason why we're working. So it's not simply just friendship or family. And the way in which we do that and the work we do depends on our personality. It depends on our training and frame of reference. It depends on the time we have available. It depends on the client. So there's what I would describe as a therapeutic zone in which there is an enormous blurring between coaching and psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
Where I think there is a difference is psychotherapy, to my mind, the talking cure, is very, very important and I would say essential where someone doesn't recognize the problem or they can't put words to the problem, where a client has no capacity to symbolize, no capacity to work with something, that requires a long period of time. And it requires relationship forming over a long period of time, a relationship which is trusted, which is holding, and a slow circling towards the core issue. Psychotherapy is well suited to that. Coaching is not well suited to that. We work in smaller amounts, often more expensive, and it's framed often by organizational parameters and timeframes. And I think that difference is a difference. I think that's a material difference. Otherwise, the topics can vary. I mean, I work with clients who've been in analysis, for example, for several years, and they talk to me about stuff which is, they talk about trauma, and they talk about, because they can talk about trauma because they've spent 2 years talking about trauma. And as a coach, I'm quite happy to talk to them about that in the context of their work. It's good coaching work, actually, because it's live and it talks about their relationship to the organization. But they're able to talk about it. If I was working with a client who was clearly unable to function well without exploring a topic that they were not comfortable or capable of exploring, I think that lends itself more to the timeframes of psychotherapy.
Yeah, I think you're right. The time frames is, I think, one of the absolutely clear differences, isn't it? Typically, although you do obviously have some people who have a coach who's on a retainer and they will work with them over a long period of time, but more typically you're in a fixed number of hours or sessions or whatever.
Yeah, and the organization's always meddling in the background.
Yes, I have to say that quite often we have an official agenda and a unofficial agenda that runs alongside it. That the two are related, but they don't necessarily want to be talking to their boss or whoever in the organisation about some of the things that we're working on because they're very personal.
Although actually, I'd also say that I do know in some, let's say, institutional psychotherapeutic context, so let's say the NHS, the organisation has a similar kind of prurient interest. So again, that's another issue that it's a difference, but is it really? I think it's really complicated on that basis. And in part, the training is about the coach, because I think coaches need to look very hard at themselves and think, what am I able to work with?
Yes.
And I'll work with what I'm able to work with. And that is also a line that's very problematic. I mean, I've seen coaches work with things like vulnerability, for example, or neurodiversity, who are not qualified to do that work and leave a trail of chaos in their wake.
Yes, and it's why I went back and did an additional 3 years training, which of course was significantly longer than my original coach training, because I wanted to be able to, I was getting stuck and I wanted to be able to work and give people a more transformational experience than I felt I was able to or happy to. Brilliant. Right, let's jump back to my usual set of questions. What advice would you give to your younger self?
Well, yeah, I thought about this actually when I sort of was talking earlier with you, and I can honestly say I wouldn't give any advice to my younger self, because my younger self wouldn't listen to my advice. So, broadly pointless thing. I'd probably just say keep on doing what you're doing, and we'll live with whatever happens.
That's a bit like that Back to the Future argument, isn't it? If you go back and then things would change and then you wouldn't even be here giving advice because things would have changed.
But I mean, joking apart, I mean, if I look at the kind of mistakes I made when I was younger, they are the things that have made me what I am now. So
exactly.
I wouldn't be what I am without doing some of the disastrously awful things that I did. And I think, yeah, in a way, ignorance is bliss, not just because it's nice to not know, but because actually in one way it's all part of the unfolding of life. There is an inevitability to how we live. And I think the core issue is just to pay attention to it. But if you're not ready to pay attention, you won't anyway. As I said to you, when Peter said to me, not everything is a fight, Laurence, I remember at the time, I genuinely didn't understand what he was talking about. It took me several years before I kind of got really what he was talking about and was able to do something with it.
Do you know, I love what you just said there. And it's just so reassuring as someone who works in development that quite often you'll say something or something will happen at a time and it has no impact on that individual or appears to have no impact on them at all. Yet years later, it's lodged in their brain and they suddenly understand it, and it can be transformational. And that for me is both heartening and sad, because you don't always get to know about it. But, that idea that it's floated around in your brain for ages, and then suddenly you're like, oh, that's what he meant.
But this is an important point, because there's an innate narcissism with coaching, which is, I'm
Yes.
going to ask a powerful question, change your world, which is it's just nonsense, and very narcissistic nonsense. I'm very uncomfortable with that, because I think, the reality of our work is we kind of blunder into our clients and we sort of hopefully help them to think about something in a better way. And all we can really do in that time is hold them through that process of chaos in which something happens. And it has something to do with us in the sense that we are there and we are symbolically useful, but it doesn't have anything really cognitive to do with us. It's much more of an emotional state. And there was a great moment for me a few years ago, which really reminded me of this, which was I bumped into a woman on the train going into London, and who I hadn't seen for years. And she'd been a coaching client for about 7 or 8 years previously. And she said to me, "Oh, it's really good to meet you. What you said to me changed my life." And I thought, "Oh, this is fantastic. Here I am, powerful questions, very exciting." And she told me what I'd said to her. And the two things that were striking to me was, one, I don't remember saying it. But the really interesting thing was, I'm sure I didn't say it, because the thing she said I'd said is not the sort of thing I'd say. And I just remember sort of as I sort of broke this down, thinking it's interesting because she associates that idea with me, but almost certainly it comes from her. And all I did was provide a space within which she could have that excuse to know what she already knew. I probably wouldn't have suggested anyway. But it's nice that it changed her life. And it gave me a little bit of humility, I think, about the difference we can make to our clients.
Yes. I totally agree. I totally agree. And I also I believe that they always know the answer. It's just our job is to kind of, I always have an image of our clients. They're looking in, to the left, the answer's to the right, and they're refusing to look to the right because they don't want to. And our job is just to kind of help them. But they know the answer inside themselves.
Absolutely. I fully agree. And it's just difficult, but at the same time, if we're able to provide the container within which that can happen, that's enough. And so if coaching is then just about providing a holding environment and a container within that environment, yeah, that's good enough. It works for me.
I always think on a leadership development program, all the real work happens in the bar in the evening.
Oh, yeah, there's lots of that.
When you're not there.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can say in the years afterwards, because,
Yes.
people realize things and then suddenly they'll notice and then it'll start to sink in, and it's still the right work. The fact that they weren't ready for it at the point at which it happened doesn't actually.
I had a great coaching client recently who was on a leadership program, and he'd said, he'd been on this great leadership program previously and he'd not made the most of it because he wasn't ready for it. He was ready this time. And it was really interesting how he really threw himself into it. But he recognized that he'd not really taken much from the previous one because he knew he wasn't ready.
Which paradoxically is a fantastic piece of learning.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes, absolutely. A sort of meta piece of learning about the whole thing.
But the real deal, right? Because we did. I remember working on a women's program and we were doing work on shadow. And one of the participants said to me, I'm not prepared to look at my shadow, but I am prepared to admit that I might have one. And for me, that was like, good, that's enough.
Yes.
Where we need to be. Everything else is done. Because I think there's this fantasy by the coach that the outcome that the organization needs and the person states and the person the coach needs is the outcome we'll get. And the reality of development, it's probably not going to happen. Something will happen, and hopefully it'll be something good.
Yes. Yes, I find it very difficult. Some organizations want some kind of coaching contract. And I'm like, really, in this period of time, you think you're going to get some really concrete outcomes that life's not like that. Makes me uncomfortable. Absolutely. Right. Tell me about books you'd recommend, because I will clearly go out and buy all of them.
I've
liked the idea of the ones you've mentioned so far. What's your book called? Let's advertise your book first.
My book is, my book's great. Buy my book. It's called A Jungian Approach to Coaching, and it's a kind of short summary of Jungian theory and how it may apply, or some Jungian theory, not other bits I've left out, and how it may apply into a kind of modern coaching practice. I think for people who are interested in Jungian work, I mean, there's just a couple off the top of my head. I'd always recommend reading Jung's biography, which is called Memories, Dreams, Reflections. It's a good read if you want to understand Jung. And if anyone wants to talk about Jung or read Jung, I recommend that as your entry point rather than some of the more difficult texts. So that's fun. Another book that I often give to people, and I'd recommend because it's a really good kind of entry point to Jungian work, but also it's a brilliant read, and it's one that is profoundly important, is a book on midlife by James Hollis, which is called The Middle Passage, it's a fabulous book, actually. Very small, very thin, really, really good, very inspirational. But otherwise, I mean, I think there's so much to read. I mean, what I would always recommend to any coach who is developing their practices, just read lots of stuff and see what sticks and follow your interest, because there's an awful lot of things that don't speak to you. And that probably says as much about your practice and the way it's developing as it does about the book. And focus on the things where you go, yes, I know that. That is what I believe. Read some more of that. And although there's an issue of not necessarily confronting yourself with difference, and I think that is a risk, I think at the same time, I would take a more progressive stance and think, well, become better at the things that matter to you.
One of my guests said, find a book you like and really read it multiple times. And I just thought, well, I'm terrible for reading a third of a book and discarding it. But read it multiple times. I thought, oh, that's really interesting.
I love that as a piece of advice. I think that's absolutely true. Yeah, I buy that.
Although, interestingly, there are a few books that I absolutely love that I have read multiple times because they really, work books, not fiction. Right, last question. Any themes you have observed whilst we've been having this conversation? Themes about yourself or your approach? I'm curious.
I think it's interesting. It's quite a personal podcast, this. And I think one of the things that is always interesting to me is how hard it is to talk about ourselves. And I think it's important to remember that, because we can, as coaches, get quite blasé about having these conversations with our clients. But for our clients to talk about themselves is a difficult thing to do. It requires a degree of rapport. It requires a degree of trust. And even then, am I really going to go there? Do I really want to talk about it? It's been for me quite a personal conversation, and I've enjoyed that. But at the same time, there's still this feeling of, that was quite personal.
Yeah.
And I do this for a living, as do you.
Yeah.
And I think it's just a useful reminder.
Absolutely. Yes, I've been interviewed on my own podcast, and I absolutely hear what you're saying. But I really genuinely appreciate it. I have loved this. I could honestly talk to you for another 2 hours easily. But thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun, actually. Really cool. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. This podcast is brought to you by Heresy Consulting. If you enjoyed today's episode, hit subscribe so you're the first to hear new conversations. And if you found it valuable, do a friend a favour and share it with them too.